Welcome to the podcast of the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. JABA is a psychology journal that publishes research about applications of the experimental analysis of behavior to problems of social importance. In this episode, we'll be talking to Dr. Wendy Donlin of the University of North Carolina at Wilmington. Dr. Donlin, along with her co-authors Kelly Banna and Amanda Gibson, published a paper titled Preliminary Efficacy of Prize-Based Contingency Management to Increase Activity Levels in Healthy Adults in the most recent issue of JABA, the summer 2014 issue. Dr. Donlin has agreed to take some time to talk to us about the research described in that paper. So Dr. Donlin, first, thank you for agreeing to talk with me for this podcast. I'm really looking forward to it. I was wondering if you could start by providing us the quick and dirty overview of what you did and why you did it.
Okay, I'll start with why we did this study. There's an epidemic of obesity in the United States, and there's a couple of important behaviors that affect this condition. Physical activity and eating. And it's an important problem that's costing us billions of dollars in healthcare, and it's estimated that obesity-related conditions actually comprise 21% of the U.S. healthcare expenditures. We wanted to develop an approach to increasing physical activity using reinforcement, but we wanted to test our approach in a broad population before targeting specific populations like those with obesity or diabetes or older adults. So what we did is we recruited healthy adults by advertising for individuals who were just interested in winning prizes for being physically active. We had no problem getting participants. We asked that they wear a Fitbit pedometer during all waking hours for a week, and we wanted to assess their baseline activity levels. We required that the participants text us every night what the number was on their Fitbit. And then when they came to the lab, we verified those self-reports directly. And if the reported numbers were really close, the participants earned a prize draw, basically just for wearing the Fitbit that first week. They had a 50% chance of winning a small prize. After the baseline, though, we started a reinforcement phase. What we did is we set goals for participants based on their own behavior. We didn't want to just arbitrarily say, okay, tomorrow you have to walk 5 miles, because a lot of people are unable to do that immediately if that's not something that they're used to doing. So we used a percentile schedule to calculate their step goals for each individual person. We tried a couple of different percentiles for different subjects, but most of the time we used what was called the 5 out of 7 percentile, which means that you have to do better than 70% of the last 7 days that you've walked. So we rank ordered their last 7 days of walking. We said that they had to be better than 5 of those 7 last days. Now, if they met that step criteria goal, we allowed them a prize draw again. So now the prize draws are contingent upon meeting your goal, and the prizes got a little bit better. 50% of the tickets that they drew from were non-winners, but the other 50% were winners, and we had small, medium, large, and jumbo prizes, the jumbo prizes being worth up to $120. So we did that phase for a week, and then we went back to a return to baseline condition for another week, where they went back to only earning prize draws based upon wearing the Fitbit. They were no longer given goals, and they were only winning small prizes at that point.
Excellent. Thank you. That was a very nice executive summary. I trust that the listeners can go and read the original article for the details, but what I want to do now is just ask you about a few aspects of the study and the report of the study to maybe add to what's been published in the journal article. So first, I was wondering if you could tell us what made you choose the Fitbit as your measurement device.
The Fitbit is the first affordable accelerometer that I was aware of that allowed time-stamped pedometer technology. So rather than a typical pedometer with no memory, it just counts steps. You don't know when every step occurred. But the Fitbit actually tells you when each step was occurring. It puts steps into 1 minute bins. You can see exactly the patterns of behavior throughout the day. It also measures movements on 3 different planes, so we can tell if you're going up and down, side to side, or front to back. And it has a memory of 3 days for very detailed information. So as long as we were getting contact with our participants every 3 days, we knew exactly when every step was taking place. Now, if they couldn't meet with us for 3 days, we also knew their aggregated step count for up to 10 days. So if we didn't see them for 10 days, we knew still how many steps that they were taking each day. I also partnered with Fitbit as an API developer, and they let me download very detailed information from their website that isn't typically reported on their Fitbit website for the consumer. You know, it's not a perfect device, but it allowed us a lot more freedom at measuring and verifying physical activity than was available previous to this study.
Excellent, thank you. Another question about your methods. I was wondering how you decided on the prize draw economy itself and on the items that you included in that economy.
Yeah, I've done a lot of research previously in the drug abuse area, specifically contingency management. And one of the problems that those researchers have been working on is how do we deliver powerful but cheap interventions? You know, if we have an infinite amount of money, it's really easy to change behavior, but we don't. So Nancy Petrie, who's a researcher at the University of Connecticut, developed this very successful approach to reinforce abstinence in drug users. And I thought I would take that technology and try to import it into a new behavior, which is physical activity, because it had been so successful. And I didn't have any grant money to collect data, so minimizing costs was really important. As far as what the prizes were, our lab informally polled our target audience. We knew that we would mostly be getting college students in our study, so we asked them what they'd be willing to work for. So our small prizes were pretty easy. They were worth about $5, and these were things like office supplies or recent novels, sunblock, golf balls, jump drives, things like that. We had more of those prizes than anything else because that's what people were most likely to win. Now, the medium prizes included things like DVD movies, candles, which are our most favorite prize that people won, and some moderately priced sporting supplies. Larger prizes were things like electronics, digital picture frames, and portable DVD players, and our jumbo prizes, which I think is why everybody wanted to be in the study, were things like Kindles and GPS systems. Also, the participants were allowed to request items. So if they looked into our catalog and they didn't see anything that they wanted, they were allowed to request that we get some better prizes in our stock. But that actually never happened.
Okay, great. Now, you've talked a little bit about what you did. Now I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what you found. So generally speaking, what were the results of the study?
Yeah, it was actually pretty exciting because we had some success with our intervention. 2/3 of the participants of our 12 showed that they increased their physical activity during the goal reinforcement phase. 4 of our subjects showed clear increases. If you look at the paper and you see subjects 1, 2, 6, and 10, graphically you can very clearly see that they changed their behavior significantly. There were another 4 subjects who had average daily increases in step count. We did find out that there was a lot of variability in step counts from day to day, so we did have to rely on averages more than most behavior analytic studies. So we also did something called a repeated measures ANOVA and found a significant effect overall. Step counts were usually higher in the reinforcement phase than in the baseline phase. Another thing we found out was that some of our participants, being that they were young college students, were already pretty active, logging up to 10 miles a day. So the CDC recommends that we walk about 10,000 steps a day. But some of our participants were already walking 20,000 steps in their baseline. So it can be argued that those participants didn't actually need an intervention to increase their physical activity. And we're using that as a screening tool in the future. We also examined some other factors like weather or whether your body mass index were related to treatment success, and they didn't seem to be. But the one thing that did seem to be important is that the more inactive that people were in baseline, the easier it was to change their behavior and the bigger effect size that we saw during the intervention.
Interesting. Could you say a little more about the various data analyses you used and what led you to decide on those specific analyses? For example, the correlations between step counts and the 4 variables you report are very interesting. Could you summarize those correlations and tell us what led you to that analysis?
Absolutely. Daily step count tells you something. It tells you, you walk 7,000 steps today. That's kind of interesting, but it doesn't tell you important features like how long were you awake and walking around? How quick is your pace of walking? How long do you take breaks for? How frequently do you take breaks? And how many steps do you typically take in a row? And I think those are very important aspects of walking behavior. And before embarking on this line of research, I absolutely had no idea. If I just told somebody how, I need you to walk more tomorrow, I didn't know what strategy they would take in order to affect that change. So they could walk at a faster pace, but for the same amount of time. They could walk at the same pace, but walk for longer durations. They could change their pace and their length of walking. They might take fewer breaks. And I wanted to be able to characterize these structural aspects of behavior. I knew that I couldn't publish a cumulative record for every day for every subject, because that would have been 252 graphs, and I'm pretty sure Java wouldn't have appreciated that. So we've settled on a few important dimensions, like within bout rate. That approximates, your pace during a bout of walking. We also have a bout length, which indicates the average number of steps you take within a bout. We have an average pause length, which is the amount of time you're typically not active between bouts of behavior. And we've also characterized how many active minutes there were during the day. Just if you took one step in a minute, it counted as an active minute. So what we did is we ran correlations between all of those measures I just described with overall step count. And we found that each person was slightly different in how they changed their behavior. So I think that's really interesting. But we did see some important patterns. Almost everybody who increased their physical activity increased their active minutes throughout the day. And so just getting people to walk more minutes and not being any more specific than that might be enough to impact their behavior. For example, subject 2 simply met their goals by increasing their active minutes. Didn't change their pace, didn't change other structural aspects of walking. There were other patterns too. So pause durations, the amount of time that you're not active, were negatively correlated with step counts, which is exactly what we expected. And we saw that, for example, subject 12 basically just took shorter pauses between bouts of walking. A few subjects changed their within bout rate. So subjects 6 and 16 walked faster when they were walking, but didn't walk significantly longer durations. Most subjects changed a little bit of more than one of those. So I think it was really interesting to see that different subjects took different approaches to increasing their walking.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think those analyses are a really nice feature of this paper. Sticking with the data analyses, I was wondering if you could explain the log survivor analysis you report, because I think many Java readers might be unfamiliar with it.
Yeah, it's an approach that's mostly been used in the basic operant research, and it was originally developed just to characterize what a unit of behavior was. So, pressing a lever, which is what you typically see in a basic operant experiment, pushing it a bunch of times in a row might be different than starting to go back to pushing the lever after you've taken a big break. So initiating responses might be different functionally than remaining responding while you're already doing it. So there's this mathematical approach. You could arbitrarily say that a bout of behavior is any number of responses that occur in a row without a particular pause in between. So with walking, you could say, if there's been 3 minutes in a row where you didn't walk, then your bout has ended. But it is arbitrary. So what the bout analysis lets you do is actually take the inner response times between steps. So you actually get an average and a response time for every step that you take during the day, and use that to derive these measures and determine what a bout of behavior actually is. So you need to know all the interval response times through the day, and you derive an equation that characterizes those bouts into the proportion of responses that occur within a bout, the within bout rate of those specific responses. It also quantifies bout initiation rate, so how often do you start responding after you've taken a pause, and those can be converted into pause durations. So we used the log survivor analysis to come up with those dependent measures that I described in reference to your last question. And I think that it's an important thing for Java readers to be aware of, because it can be used to characterize so many other types of behavior as well. I could see someone using this to characterize problem behaviors throughout the day, or when you consume drugs. You know, most people don't equally just take drinks of alcohol randomly throughout the day. It's usually a bout of drinking separated by a bout of not drinking. Or you could see how productive people are in a workplace. Do they go through bouts of productivity and then take breaks? And I would point anybody who's interested in this type of analysis to a set of basic articles by Rick Shull, who first introduced this analysis as a way to analyze operant behavior.
Great, thank you. I think that's going to be useful to many listeners. I appreciate that. These within bout and between bout step analyses were particularly interesting aspects of your study. Can you say a bit more about how those data might be used in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So in physical activity, not all activity is equal. Taking a lot of steps in a row seems to have a bigger impact on health than equally distributing steps over a long period of time. So what I plan on doing with these bout characterizations is to create targeted interventions for physically inactive people in the future. So you could require that someone increase their pace of walking to have a bigger impact rather than just say increase it by 300 steps. Another thing that we found is that some people have very strict schedules with their work and school throughout the day, so there's only certain periods of time where they could increase their physical activity. So if we can identify those periods of time, then we can target, take more steps during this period of time at a particular within bout rate. And it might be that changing one of these aspects, so maybe it's easier to change someone's pace of walking than their duration of walking. These are empirical questions. I really don't know which is easier to change. So that's something that I'd like to explore in the future.
I see. Oh, that makes really good sense. Thank you. Now, although your study focused on the contingency management intervention with the prize draws, there was a sort of self-monitoring component because participants were seeing their own performance each day. I was wondering, in your estimation, how important was that self-monitoring aspect of the intervention? That is, them being able to see their own performance, and also the relatively frequent meeting with experimenters for data purposes.
I think you make a great point. I do think that it's possible and very likely that the feedback from the Fitbit, the goal setting, and the social nature of reporting steps back to a real person influence behavior. They absolutely had some influence. It could be that just looking at the Fitbit and seeing a big number is a reinforcer in and of itself. And then having to come to the lab and see somebody who you just told you had a really low step count for might be embarrassing. So both of those things could lead to increases in physical activity. But what was really important to note is that would have affected the entire, study. They're doing that in baseline, they're doing that during the intervention, and we do see increases in behavior above and beyond those effects during the intervention. So reinforcing meeting goals had an impact that was above and beyond those effects. I think that we need to study those social and feedback components of these types of interventions a lot more specifically, and I know that Jesse Dallery is doing some of that work down at Florida, and I plan on manipulating and studying some of those variables empirically as well.
Excellent. Now, taking all of the data together, what your results were, what are the most important things you learned from this particular study?
Well, I was happy to know that we could greatly change behavior using a moderate intermittent reinforcer. Now, they did have prize draws every day, but actually winning a prize was intermittent. They did not win every single time. So it's important to know that we can impact physical behavior with reinforcement, and that it can be relatively cheap. And as important as this field is of being physically fit and not obese or overweight, I think behavior analysis has a really important place that we should take in this field that's sort of consuming the United States right now, and I think that we should have a bigger presence there.
Great. Now, with this line of research, do you have any immediate plans for extending it in any way?
Yes, absolutely. We've already completed 2 follow-up studies, and we're beginning 3 more this year. So as you can tell, we're really excited and planning on continuing this line of research. Some of the things we need to figure out are the specifics of, like, how often do we need to reinforce this behavior? Do we have to do it every single day? How big does the reinforcer have to be? Is it different when we target special populations? So what if we recruit older adults or obese individuals in our study? Are we going to have as big of an impact on their behavior? How long can we maintain this sort of intervention? This study was only a 1-week intervention. Maybe the effect wears off after 2 months of this kind of intervention. I think that's an important thing to look at. And what happens when you terminate the reinforcement intervention? Is there any long-term effect? You would hope, as a treatment provider, that it would last longer than the reinforcement, although as a researcher, you would hope that you would see, direct correlations with the reinforcement contingency. So I foresee that this is going to be a long and fruitful line of research for me and many other researchers in the field.
Well, that's good from a research perspective. It sounds like you're going to be busy, and I hope we see at least some of that work on the pages of JABA. Given that you are so busy, I want to thank you again for taking your time and talking with us more about this study. I enjoyed it, and I hope you had a good time too.
Thank you, Matt. It was great.
The music featured in this podcast is titled Pangea and is courtesy of